And welcome back to the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan Silva. On this week's episode, we're talking about the life and times and best hits of jazz icon Eric Dolphy. And on this hour, we're going to be talking about some of his best albums of all time. To start off with this one, Out There, released in 1961. This was an album from Dolphy's early days. At this point, he was still new to the jazz scene, performing alongside jazz legends at the time like John Coltrane, and yet his playing here holds true in this album. Some of the highlights of this album: the bluesy melody Serene, a sweet flute melody, Sketch of Melba, a classic love ballad. There's also 3 tribute pieces to Charles Mingus. Overall, a melancholy compilation of hits by Dolphy and his band. Iron Man was released in 1968, a groundbreaking record in many ways. In this album, Dolphy takes standard or classic songs and turns them into something completely novel. Also features some original compositions by him. So it's a beautiful album from 60s avant-garde jazz. And an album called Conversations, released in 1963. So in 1963, Eric Dolphy made a series of recordings that were later issued on long plays. This one's a beautiful music compilation featuring some beautiful renditions of jazz classics. So that was a quick recap of some of the albums we're going to be discussing on this hour. This is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan Silva. We're going for a short break. We'll be right back after that. Stay tuned. And welcome back to the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan Silva. On this week's episode, we're talking about the life and times and best hits of jazz icon Eric Dolphy. And on this hour, we're going to be talking about some of his best albums of all time. The first album is called Out There, released in 1961. This was an album from Dolphy's early days. At this point, he was still new to the jazz scene, performing alongside jazz legends at the time like John Coltrane, and yet his playing holds true in this album. So this one's one of his best albums from around that time. It was the follow-up to Outward Bound and his second album on the Prestige label. One technical point from the album is how Dolphy gives it its unique flavor by combining cello and bass clarinet music. George Davies on bass and Ron Carter on clarinet. And this album also provides a glimpse into his innovative ideas. Some of the highlights of this album: the bluesy melody Serene, a sweet flute melody, Sketch of Melba, that's a classic love ballad. There's also 3 tribute pieces to Charles Mingus, a moody nostalgic piece he wrote alongside Dolphy called Eclipse. There's also a choppy solo from Carter called The Baron. 17 West, a post-bop standard, performed with flute and cello music. A regretful, soulful ballad called Feathers. So overall, a melancholy compilation of hits by Dolphy and his band. Iron Man was released in 1968. So this album was released in a period Dolphy was starting to make a name for himself as one of the biggest jazz innovators on the block. This album was actually released many years later, but it was recorded in 1963. A groundbreaking record in many ways. In this album, Dolphy takes standard or classic songs and turns them into something completely novel. Also features some original compositions by him. His fame as a composer was also making waves at the time that he wrote these songs, and in this album, his compositions rival those of John Coltrane or Miles Davis. Songs like the title track and the song Mandrake. Also his cover of the jazz classics in this album: Come Sunday by Duke Ellington, a melancholy take on the classic between Dolphy and Davis on bass and clarinet. Burning Spear, a rendition of a movie soundtrack crafted to fit his unique playing style. So it's a beautiful album from 60s avant-garde jazz. Conversations was released in 1963. So in 1963, Eric Dolphy made a series of recordings that were later issued on long plays. Conversations was one such album. These long plays have been released several times on various labels. Out to Lunch was another example. Conversations is an eclectic music compilation featuring some beautiful renditions of jazz classics and a mix-up of Caribbean music tracks. For example, the track Music Matador featuring Prince Lasha on flute and Sonny Simmons on alto saxophone. On Jitterbug Waltz, a jazz classic, we see the newer members of the band coming through. Bobby Hutcherson, who was starting out at the time, he's on vibraphone, Woody Shaw on trumpet. On the second set of songs in this album, it's Dolphy's solos. There's a beautiful performance on the song Love Me. Another highlight of the album, Alone Together, a 13-minute duet between Dolphy and bassist Richard Davis. This album was recorded at a time when Dolphy was really pushing to improve himself as a musician, and the results are outstanding. That was a compilation of more of Eric Dolphy's best albums of all time, and this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan Silva. And welcome back to the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan Silva. On this week's episode, it's about Eric Dolphy's life and times and best albums, and now it's time to talk about some promo news. Now trending on the jazz albums chart this week, Shadow by Liz Wright. This one's a very melancholy album. It discusses the themes of lost love and grief. It blends the themes of melancholy and being driven to succeed against all odds. The album combines a series of original compositions and classics. and it's Liz Wright on vocals backed by guitar and string instrumentals. There's plenty of epic tracks on this album. One highlight is the song Lost in the Valley, a mesmerizing violin solo by Arun Ramamurthy. Another highlight, Liz Wright's vocals on the cover of I Concentrate on You. She's backed by guitar, drums and string instrumentals on this melody. Also her vocals on the song Who Knows Where the Time Goes, a very sad song. And on I Made a Lover's Prayer, the closing track. So Shadow by Liz Wright is now trending on the jazz albums charts for this week, and this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan De Silva. We'll be right back after some music. When we come back, we're going to be talking about more of Eric Dolphy's best hits of all time. Stay tuned. And welcome back to the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan De Silva. On this week's episode, it's about Eric Dolphy, his life and times and best hits. And on this hour, we're going to be talking about more of his best albums of all time. The first album is called Other Aspects, released in 1987. This one's a rather experimental album where Dolphy shifts between classical and folk theme genres. There's 5 tracks all in all. 4 of the 5 are original compositions by Dolphy. The Illinois concert, released in 1963. In 1999, a previously unreleased recording of Dolphy was discovered. It surfaced on an Eric Dolphy website and was consequently taped for mass distribution at the University of Illinois. Highlights of this album include songs like Softly as in a Morning Sunrise, Something Sweet, Something Tender, Iron Man, an original composition by Dolphy, and God Bless the Child. An album called Hot and Cold Latin, released by Dolphy in 1959. This compilation was a result of 2 albums that Dolphy had been working on in 1959 to 60, but was not released till 1996. The albums combine a variety of differently themed music into one stunning compilation. On this album, we see Dolphy navigating a range of jazz styles, from chamber jazz to Afro-Cuban jazz styles. And now for a series of albums taken from live performances in Europe titled Eric Dolphy in Europe Volume 1, 2 and 3. This album compilation was taken from a live performance in Copenhagen alongside pianist Bent Axon, bassist Eric Mosholm and drummer John Elniff in 1961. Dolphy plays several instruments throughout the concert, from flute to alto saxophone to clarinet. So on this album, we are going to be talking in depth about these albums. Stay tuned to the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan De Silva to find out more. We'll be right back after some music. And this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan De Silva. On this week's episode, it's about the life and times and best hits of Eric Dolphy. And on this hour, we're going to be talking about more of his best albums of all time. To start off with, an album called Other Aspects, released in 1987. This one's a rather experimental sort of album, where Dolphy shifts between classical and folk theme genres. There's also technical brilliance in his playing, like novel time signatures and interludes of silence in the instrumentals. A masterpiece in composition and improvisation. One of the highlights in this album is the song Jim Crow. It features the entire band coming together on a groundbreaking track. The singing is melancholy and moody. There's Dolphy N, a collaboration between bassist Ron Carter and Dolphy on sax. It's Carter's only appearance on this album, and this song is characterized by his rapid bass playing. Improvisations and takras, a beautiful oriental instrumental comprising flute, tabla and tambura instrumentals. So it's a compilation of different styles of music taken from different performances and one of Dolphy's best albums of all time. The Illinois concert was released in 1963. In 1999, a previously unreleased recording of Dolphy was discovered. It surfaced on an Eric Dolphy website, was consequently taped for mass distribution at the University of Illinois. It was produced by Michael Cascana. One highlight of this album are Eric Dolphy's performances on the songs Softly as in a Morning Sunrise and a miniature of Something Sweet, Something Tender. There's also an outstanding solo on the song God Bless the Child. A beautiful alto saxophone piece by Dolphy on Iron Man, one of his original compositions. The background instrumentals are made up by Herbie Hancock on piano, Eddie Locke on bass, and drummer J.C. Moses. On the final 2 tracks, the University of Illinois Brass Ensemble Band joins in, and they include Cecil Bridgewater on trumpet. Now for a series of albums taken from live performances in Europe titled Eric Dolphy in Europe, Volume 1, 2 and 3. This album compilation was taken from a live performance in Copenhagen alongside pianist Bent Axon, bassist Eric Mosholm and drummer John Elniff in 1961. On the first CD, Volume 1, Dolphy plays on an array of instruments. He plays solo on bass clarinet on God Bless the Child, switches to flute for Glad to be Unhappy, and then to bass clarinet on Oleo. There's also an alto saxophone duet with bassist Chuck Israel on High Fly. Volume 2 is the second CD issued from this concert. This one's characterized by Dolphy's improvisation on flute and alto saxophone. There's a flute cover of Don't Blame Me and an alto saxophone track on The Way You Look Tonight, also an emotional rendition of the song Laura. In Volume 3, there's 3 versions of the classic In the Blues, and 2 clarinet performances by Dolphy on bass and alto on the songs When the Lights Are Low and Woody and You. And an album called Hot and Cold Latin, released by Dolphy in 1959. This compilation was a result of 2 albums that Dolphy had been working on from 1959 to 60, but was not released till 1996. The albums combine a variety of differently themed music into one stunning compilation. On the first 8 tracks, Dolphy is backed by a novel quartet, bass, guitar and cello, which was unusual for him. He plays very creative chamber jazz music in these tracks. The next series of tracks see Dolphy playing in Latin jazz style fronted by a Latin jazz quartet. His playing is typically unique and creative here. The following tracks see Dolphy on flute alongside vibraphonist Felipe Diaz for a mashup of Afro-Cuban pop-themed tracks. So overall, a bunch of interesting styles woven into one performance. Also, the album features both jazz standards and original compositions. So that was a compilation of more of Eric Dolphy's best albums of all time, and this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. On this week's episode of the Jazz Update, we are talking all about Eric Dolphy, his life and times and best hits. We've come to an end of today's episode of the Jazz Update, so now let's recap what we were talking about on today's program. So Eric Dolphy was a clarinet, flute and saxophone whiz. He rose to prominence in the 60s alongside other jazz greats at his time. Among his accolades, he was one of the first pioneers in bass clarinet playing in jazz and one of the greatest improvisers on the instrument. His improvisational style was wild and creative and won him a name as a very innovative improviser on the clarinet. Dolphy's playing was a blend of avant-garde and free jazz. So Dolphy grew up in Los Angeles. He started out performing in local bands, most notably the Roy Porter Big Band. His big break came when he was invited to perform alongside the Chico Hamilton Quintet, with whom he toured and performed until 1958. He then settled down in New York City, where his fame grew. He started collaborating with more jazz greats like Charles Mingus and John Coltrane in his New York City performances. His music was very controversial. People were divided on his unique style of playing at the time. He died in 1964, leaving behind a legacy as one of the most innovative clarinet players in jazz. So now let's talk about some of his best albums. There's an album called Out to Lunch, released in 1964 on Blue Note Records. This was one of Eric's best efforts in the bop genre. Some of the standout tracks on this album include Hat and Beard, Something Sweet, Something Tender, and Gazzalone. These were all original compositions by Dolphy. Also, this album offers us a glimpse into everything that made Dolphy's playing style so unique and remarkable. On this album, Freddie Hubbard's on trumpet, Bobby Hutcherson's on vibraphone, Richard Davis on bass, and Tony Williams on drums. Far Cry was released on the Prestige label in 1961. This one's another all-time favorite album from the hard bop genre, a mellow and relaxing album. Dolphy's on alto sax, bass clarinet and flute, Brooker Little's on trumpet. One of the highlights on this album include Ode to Charlie Parker, a beautiful flute and trumpet melody. Outward Bound was released on the Prestige label in 1960. This one's an amazing bop album, and it specially showcases Dolphy's acumen as a band leader. Also, this album is an example of jazz music that played a role in the development of jazz in the 60s. In this album, Dolphy wrote most of the songs. There's also a few classics here like On Green Dolphin Street and Miss Tony. One innovation in this album is Dolphy's use of the bass clarinet as a lead instrument, which was novel at the time. So overall, this album is a showcase both of jazz innovations at the time and the unique styles that made each of the players in this performance the legends that they would become. Iron Man was released in 1968. So this album was released in a period Dolphy was starting to make a name for himself as one of the biggest jazz innovators on the block, a groundbreaking record in many ways. In this album, Dolphy takes standard or classic songs and turns them into something completely novel. Also features some original compositions by him. It's a beautiful album from 60s avant-garde jazz. And a series of albums taken from live performances in Europe titled Eric Dolphy in Europe, Volume 1, 2 and 3. This album compilation was taken from a live performance in Copenhagen alongside pianist Bent Axon, bassist Eric Mosenholm and drummer John Elniff in 1961. Dolphy plays several instruments throughout the concert, from flute to alto saxophone to clarinet. So that was a quick recap of everything that we discussed on today's episode of the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva, and that brings me to an end of today's episode of the show. You can check out my YouTube channel for archives of today's show on the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. I'll see you again next week. Have a great week ahead.